What's going on there, YouTube? Welcome back to another comic book video. Okay, so we are here. We're going to cover the Muir Island Saga. Now, the Muir Island Saga is really important for X-Men comics for a lot of different reasons. The main reason why, because this is the book that gives birth to X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue, two X-Men teams that we're going to see in our coverage over the 1990s of the X-Men. Now, on top of that, though, this is also the end of the original X-Factor team as well, because those characters are now going to rejoin the X-Men. But it does give way for a new team to rise up and take over that name to become the new X-Factor team. A lot of different things happen in the Muir Island Saga to get us ready for the 1990s of X-Men comics. And honestly, it was a great way to wrap up the previous era. And so as we dive into the opening pages for today's video, we actually pick up with the Shadow King. Now, the Shadow King is going to be the main bad guy for today's video. Now, we have talked about the Shadow King before in our earlier parts of our coverage over the X-Men. And really, in the last few videos we have done over the X-Men, they were leading up to this moment right here, where he says, listen, my all-time goal is to go ahead and destroy the dream of Charles Xavier. Now, we already know, when it comes to Charles' dream, it's the idea of mutants and humans being able to live together in harmony. But for the Shadow King, he does not want that at all. Instead, he wants the entire world to be full of hatred. And so his goal does go completely against Charles Xavier's goal. Now, one of the characters he was able to take over early on in our coverage over the X-Men was a character known as Lian Shin. Now, Lian Shin did appear early on, and she was a doctor who found a young Storm unconscious and was trying her best to, help her recover. But the Shadow King was after Storm. And so when it came to Shadow King, when he got close enough to Storm, he found Lian and was able to take over her mind as well. But she does wonder, can the Shadow King actually win this time against Charles Xavier? Because in the past, Charles has always won. But he says, listen, this time my plan should work out. Because like I said, this is a character that has been working in the backgrounds for a while that led up to this moment right here, where it's a Shadow King saying, it's time for me to break Charles Xavier. But now we have to jump over to the WHO organization. Now, WHO stands for the Weird Happening Organization, and we had talked about them before in our coverage over Excalibur. Now, when it comes to the Weird Happening Organization, they just go around the world to investigate weird things happening around the world. But this time, we're going to jump over to their hangar, and the reason why, because somebody is trying to break into the hangar to steal the Blackbird. Now, remember, in our earlier parts of our coverage over Excalibur, you had the team actually take the Blackbird for their own personal use, because around that time, the world believed that the X-Men were dead. And really, for most of the world, by this point in Marvel Comics, the X-Men are still dead. And the reason why, because back in Fall of the Mutants, you had the X-Men give up their lives on live television to stop the adversary. And so when they did that, the world believed the X-Men had died that day. But in reality, the X-Men were brought back to life by Lady Roma. But you had the X-Men say, let's stay in the shadows as a way to go after our enemies without them knowing that we are coming. But getting back over to the hangar that belongs to the WHO organization, we actually see that somebody is trying to steal the Blackbird. And the reason why? Because the Blackbird is needed for our heroes to get over to Muir Island. And so the person who's trying to take it is just Charles Xavier himself. He was a one-man army, but barely being able to get away. And luckily, Storm was there too to allow some cover to allow him to get away. But I want to jump over to Muir Island. And the reason why, because in Muir Island, it was where the Shadow King really did begin to do his work behind the scenes. You see, when it came to Moira McTaggart earlier on in our coverage over the X-Men, other people began to realize that she was acting more aggressive than usual, but no one knew why. Now later on, we all learned why, because it was a Shadow King. But here's the problem though, if you had stayed on Muir Island, well, sooner or later, you will be acting like Moira McTaggart was, being more aggressive than usual. And by this point in Marvel Comics, there were a lot of mutants on Muir Island, because back in the Mutant Massacre, most of the Morlocks ran away from their tunnels underneath New York. And most of those mutants, they went over to Muir Island to have some kind of shelter. But right now, all of them are currently acting more aggressive than usual. They love the idea of hating each other, loving the idea of causing pain to each other. Now, Moira McTaggart, originally, her main goal was to study each character's mutant ability. But because currently she's under the control of the Shadow King, she now has a different way to learn more about different people's abilities by setting up some kind of arena where you have two people fight against each other to the point where somebody is going to tap out. But when they do tap out, it's because they're on the verge of death. And so as we jump over to Muir Island, we pick up with Rogue fighting against Strong Guy. Now, Rogue was the only X-Men left on Earth because the rest of the X-Men were in space trying to help Charles Xavier out, which they were able to do and bring him back to Earth. But because she had no idea where to go, she went over to Muir Island. But in a short period of time being there, the Shadow King began to work on her mind. And so we see her in the arena fighting against Strong Guy. Now, we had talked about him before. Strong Guy has the ability to absorb kinetic energy, and the more he absorbs, the stronger he gets. The problem is, sooner or later, he has to release that energy, because if he doesn't, his heart is going to give out. But Rogue is able to take him down. But the problem is, Rogue was fighting him like she wanted to kill him, like he was a bad guy. And for her, is Rogue realizing there's something wrong with her. Usually she knows how to hold back when she's fighting against one of her friends, but this time she did not. She actually enjoyed the idea of causing pain onto someone else. And so when she does go into the showers to kind of get some time away from everybody, she is confronted by the Shadow King. And just like that, he was able to get a hold on her. And so now she's under his control. But now getting back over to the main X-Men team, they do head over to Muir Island, and their main goal is to investigate what is the actual state of the island, with the Shadow King being control of the entire place. But the problem is, while you have the X-Men trying to sneak around the place, one by one, each member of the X-Men is taken out. Legion takes out Storm. You have Siren being able to take out her father, Banshee. Gambit is taken out by Madrox. Wolverine is taken out by Rogue, and of course Jubilee is taken out by Amanda Selfton. And so just like that, one by one, each member of the X-Men has been taken out, but Charles Xavier is not there at all. But now I want to jump back over to Charles Xavier, where you have Charles heading over to where the school used to be at, because back in X-Men Inferno, we saw Mr. Sinister blow up the school. And so for Charles, he can't believe in the idea the school is no longer around. But for Charles, he knows that no matter what, him and his students, they have the ability to rebuild a school back to where it used to be. Now, while he was walking around the grounds, well, that is the moment he realized a car is heading towards him. And at first, he believes the car is trying to run him over. And so he is able to get out of the way, but just barely. Now, he does find Stevie Hunter, who is the one driving the car. Now, Stevie Hunter first appeared back in X-Men number 139. And originally, she was a dance teacher for Kitty Pryde, but then later on became a physical therapist for the X-Men. Now for Stevie, the reason why she was trying to crash the car, because somebody was on top of the car trying to kill her, and that person was Colossus. And the reason why Colossus is trying to kill her is because, well, he's also have been taken over by the Shadow King. Now, the first few pages of the second chapter is really more of Colossus chasing after Charles Xavier and Stevie Hunter. Now, while you have our two characters trying their best to get away from Colossus, they do run into the sub-basement of the school, the only thing that's left of the school after Sinister had the school blown up. Now, let's not forget, around this time in Marvel Comics, the New Mutants were actually using this place as their base when they were being led by Cable. But by this point in Marvel Comics, they had just left this place to get a new base and become X-Force in X-Men Comics. Either way, you have Charles and Stevie go down there and try to use the sub-basement defense system to hopefully stop Colossus. Unfortunately, it does not work. Matter of fact, you have Charles Xavier trying his best to use the Danger Room, another way to hopefully stop Colossus as well. But again, it does not work. And so Charles realized he has to use his powers on the mind of Colossus. Now, something else I do want to mention is that when it came to Colossus around this time in Marvel Comics, he had completely forgotten who he was. And let me explain why. You see, there was an earlier story arc where you had the X-Men go through the Siege Perilous. Now, the Siege Perilous is something we had talked about before. It has the ability to give you a new life, a new beginning somewhere else in the world. Now, sometimes you are able to remember everything in your past life, and sometimes you are not able to remember anything from your past life. And so most of the X-Men were able to remember most of the things in their past life. But when it came to Colossus, though, he forgotten everything. And matter of fact, he had a new life where he was actually happy, where he was able to be an artist. But the problem was the Shadow King found him. And the Shadow King realized that Colossus was an easy target to take over. And so it's Charles saying, I have to get rid of his new life and fix his mind to bring back his old life, to remember who he was before he had went through the Siege Perilous. And just like that, Colossus is no longer under the Shadow King control, but also Colossus now remembers everything from his past life before going through the Siege Perilous. Now, the Shadow King is a multiversal being, which means that he has the ability to appear across the multiverse in all realities. But here's the catch though, to be able to work in those different realities, he has to have a host to control to allow him to work in those different realities. Now, around his time in Marvel Comics, his host was a character known as Jacob. Now, Jacob was an FBI agent who actually found Storm unconscious and took her to a nearby hospital. Now, after doing that, Jacob's mind and body was taken over by the Shadow King. But here's the problem though. You see, the Shadow King is kind of like Proteus, where both characters have the ability to take over someone's body, except when they do, that host body begins to burn out, and sooner or later, they're gonna have to find a new body to use. So for the Shadow King, he has to find a new body to use because right now the body he has, Jacob, is currently dying off. Now, he was able to use his powers as a way to keep the body alive long enough. But the problem is, he's right now trying to use his powers on so many different people across the world. The idea to spread hatred across the world. And so the more time he tries to use his powers on other things besides Jacob, the body begins to burn up even faster. And so he realized that sooner or later, he has to find a new body. But the question is, who is going to be the new host for the Shadow King? But now I want to jump over to Forge, and here is the reason why. Because earlier we saw different members of the X-Men be taken out by the people who are being controlled by the Shadow King on Muir Island. But Forge was one of the people who was not attacked. Now thankfully, Forge also has a device that allows him to be protected from the Shadow King. And matter of fact, you have Forge use that same device on other people to help them break away from the control of the Shadow King. Now, unfortunately, it's only two people, Wolverine and also Rogue. But now they were able to break away from his control to help out Forge to get other people on their side. Now, getting back over to Colossus, Stevie Hunter, and Charles Xavier, they see a crowd of people chasing down a young boy. Now, the young boy who's being chased right now is not because, his skin color or because he's a mutant. It's really more the idea that the Shadow King is now being able to influence people across the world with his hatred. And so now other people are beginning to become more aggressive towards one another. And so right now they're chasing after this young boy because the Shadow King has influenced them. Now Charles is able to stop them, but he realized that things have gotten completely out of control. And he also knows that his X-Men team had failed on Muir Island thanks to the Shadow King. But he also knows he has one team left that he can use to hopefully fix everything. And that would be X-Factor, the original 5 X-Men. But now we jump over to X-Factor number 69. Now, like I said earlier, when it comes to X-Factor, this story arc is going to see the original team leave and rejoin the X-Men, but leave room for a new team to take up the mantle of X-Factor. So we actually do pick up with the team right now in Washington, D.C. Now, they were called up by Val Cooper. Now, Val Cooper works alongside with the president. Now, she does deal with most of the superpower being stuff for the president. But the reason why she called up X-Factor is because, well, the people in Washington, D.C. have gone mad as well. They're full of rage and hatred. And again, they're being influenced by the Shadow King. Now, when it comes to the crowd of people, someone does have a gun and they do shoot someone else. And you have X-Factor being able to calm down the crowd, find the shooter, and get the gun away from the shooter. But for our heroes, they're kind of wondering, okay, what is exactly happening here? But on top of that, why did you call us for? Why not call in other heroes like the Avengers or the Fantastic Four? But the president himself and someone else close to them had requested X-Factor to be here. And that other person would be Charles Xavier. And this was Charles saying, listen, I need your help to bring down the one person who was the main reason why I put together the X-Men 4, to achieve the dream of the idea of mutants and humans being able to live together. And that would be the Shadow King. He's right now trying to ruin that dream by having everyone on this earth hate each other because he feeds on hatred. But now I want to jump back over to Muir Island, where we actually pick up with Forge, Wolverine, and also Rogue as well, where they were able to get the jump on Banshee. Now, Banshee could be an actual challenge for certain people, but after a while, you do have our heroes being able to stop him, bring him down, and you did have Forge being able to use the same device used on Wolverine and Rogue earlier to break Banshee free from the control of the Shadow King. And so now we have at least 4 members of the X-Men on Muir Island who can still try their best to work together to bring down the Shadow King. But now we have to jump back over to Charles Xavier and X-Factor as they work their way over to Muir Island. And matter of fact, they're trying to sneak their way over to Muir Island by using a submarine. Now, on their way over there, they are discussing their game plan on how to bring down the Shadow King. And first, they have to get rid of his host. Now, we know who his host is. That would be Jacob. Now, also, you have Charles say, we have to get rid of the person who is the Nexus Point for the Shadow King. Now, the Nexus Point is a character who has the ability to help the Shadow King spread his influence around the world, to make more and more people begin to hate one another. But at the same time, that character is also the reason why the Shadow King is able to constantly return back into this reality. And so if they want to make sure that he is not able to come back, they have to get rid of the Nexus Point, and that would be Polaris. Let me explain. So in an earlier story arc, Polaris lost the ability to control metal, but she did gain 2 more abilities: super strength and also the ability to play with people's emotions. Now, when it comes to that second ability, she could not control that at all. But the Shadow King realized that he could use that as a way to help spread his influence around the world. And so he made her his Nexus Point. Now, while you have our heroes discussing their entire game plan, they have no idea that Jacob, the Shadow King's host, is also on the submarine. Like, yes, they know he's on there, but they have no idea that he is the Shadow King's host. And also Val Cooper is also under his control as well. And so our heroes are just going on and on with their game plan, but not knowing the Shadow King is listening in so easily. And so once you have X Factor being able to make it to Muir Island, they are confronted by a few characters who actually work for the Shadow King. Now, you have our heroes being able to take them down very easily, but you have Charles say, be careful, because we still have no idea who exactly is the host for the Shadow King. Now, for Charles, he believes it could be his son, Legion. Now, Legion does appear, and he says, nope, you are wrong. I am not the host for the Shadow King. That would be somebody else. And of course, he's talking about Jacob. Now, Jacob is on the submarine with Charles Xavier, and Charles is left open without any kind of protection. And so you have Jacob being able to come from behind and begin to choke out Charles Xavier, and then tell Charles, hey, it's me, the Shadow King. You got the wrong guy, and now you're going to die. Except we kind of find out that Val Cooper is actually Mystique. Now, this is huge because earlier on in our coverage over X-Men, we had learned that Val Cooper was also being controlled by the Shadow King, and she was ordered to kill off Mystique. And so we were left to believe that she had killed off Mystique, to only find out, no, that is not true at all. That in reality, Mystique has survived, and she was pretending to be Val Cooper as a way to get close to the Shadow King, to wait for the right moment. And right now, this is the right moment. And so when you have Jacob trying to choke out Charles Xavier, well, Mystique shoots and kills Jacob with one shot in the head. Now, with Mystique killing off Jacob, that is great because now the Shadow King no longer has a host, which means he's almost completely locked out of this reality. But there's still the Nexus Point, and that would be Polaris. And that is a huge problem right there. If Polaris is still the Nexus Point, that means he has a way back into this reality to find a new host. Now, X Factor, they know Polaris is the Nexus Point, and they're kind of wondering what to do with her, because if they do pull her out of the device, most likely she is going to die. But at the same time, they have to save the entire world from the Shadow King. But here comes the big problem. While you have everyone wondering what to do, the Shadow King was able to find a new host, and that new host is Legion. And then the entire island, the entire Muir Island, explodes, and we're left to wonder if our heroes have survived. And so as we dive into the next chapter, we do pick up with Charles Xavier arriving to the island to see what exactly happened to his students. Now, when he does arrive, he finds them. They're okay. thankfully, because Jean Grey was able to put a shield up to protect most of the people on the island, but they're now being held in some kind of stasis by Legion. Now, as we know, Legion is currently being controlled by the Shadow King, and he tells Charles Xavier, like, hey, I have your son under my control, and I plan on using your son as a way to get back at you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your son, and I'm going to kill all your students as well, as a way to win against you. Now, when it came to Charles Xavier, he came here with a few SHIELD agents, and one of those agents decides to shoot at Legion, which honestly is a huge mistake, because that agent dies instantly. Now, after he dies, we then see S.H.I.E.L.D. with Mystique say, listen, because right now things are getting worse, I am thinking our only way to make sure we are able to win against the Shadow King is to nuke the island, to nuke the area. And so sooner or later, we are talking about the idea of firing a nuke onto Muir Island to hopefully get rid of the Shadow King. But getting back over to Charles Xavier, it does look like he's about to die by Legion, who's being controlled by the Shadow King. But luckily, at the very last second, Storm arrives to save Charles Xavier from Legion. Because let's not forget, she was the first X-Men to be taken out at the very beginning of the story arc. But we have not seen her since the first chapter. And so now she's back in the picture, and she was able to do some good damage to Legion, where he has to retreat for the time being. But it gives our heroes some time to actually think of a new game plan on how they are going to be able to stop Legion, but also the Shadow King as well. And so when it comes to our heroes, their game plan is to send Charles Xavier into the astral plane. Now, the astral plane is going to be more of a psychic battle between Charles Xavier and the Shadow King. But here's the problem. While his mind is there in the astral plane, his body is left defenseless. And so they're going to need an X-Men team around to protect his body and also protect Jean Grey, because Jean Grey is going to be used as a way to make sure that Charles is able to come back into this reality and not get stuck in the astral plane. Now, the other X-Men team, they have to go out of their way to find the nexus point and get rid of it as a way to get rid of the Shadow King. And so you have our heroes go with that game plan, but the plan falls apart very quickly. And let me explain why. So as soon as Charles arrives in the astral plane, he is confronted by the Shadow King. Now, these two characters, they had fought in this dimension before, and Charles was able to win, but barely. But this time, the Shadow King is way more powerful than he was in their previous battle, where he is able to beat down on Charles Xavier. Now, all the injuries that he is taking in that dimension, he's also taking in the main Marvel universe. His physical body is also getting broken. His spine, his legs. This is a story that says, hey, you know what? Let's go ahead and put Charles back in the wheelchair once again. Now, for the other team, on their way over to the Nexus Point, they are confronted by the few members of the X-Men who are still under the control of the Shadow King. And so you have the two parties begin to fight against each other. But here's the problem. As things continue on, Charles Xavier is losing more and more when it comes to his battle against the Shadow King. And so the team who stuck around to protect him, they're all like, listen, the only way to help him is to go ahead and go into the astral plane ourselves to help him fight against the Shadow King. And so while you have both teams go their separate ways to handle their objectives, I want to shift our focus over to Forge, because Forge realized, like, okay, we have to get rid of Polaris without killing her so that we are able to get rid of the Shadow King. But the problem is, if we try to pull her out of the device the Shadow King had built, most likely she is going to die. Now, while he is thinking this, he's fighting against Psylocke. And so he realized, you know what? I can use Psylocke's psychic knife as a way to shut down the mind of Polaris. With her mind being shut down, she can no longer be his nexus point. And so he does that. He grabs Psylocke and says, hey, I'm going to use your hand to stab the mind of Polaris. Bam. And as soon as he does that, her mind completely shuts down. And then you have the Shadow King go back into his reality. He no longer has a way back into this reality. He is officially defeated. But the problem was the battle against Charles Xavier. Because like I said earlier, all the injuries that he was taking in the astral plane, well, he was also taking in the real world. And so Charles Xavier is officially back in the wheelchair again. And so getting into the epilogue for the Muir Island saga, it was a way to kind of reshuffling everything about the X-Men, really for X-Factor in the X-Men team, because New Mutants by this point had already ended and we're getting X-Force. And then on top of that, Excalibur was their own entire thing. In the Wolverine comics, never truly did tie into the rest of the X books. And so the epilogue only affected the X-Men and X-Factor. Now, one of the things we got to talk about is that when it came to Legion being the host for the Shadow King, because you had Forge being able to cut that connection, Legion fell into a coma. And so almost every morning you would have Charles Xavier try his best to sit down with his son's mind and to hopefully find a way to bring Legion out of his coma. But the problem is, though, Charles Xavier has been unsuccessful in trying to achieve that actual goal. Now, I want to shift our focus over to Val Cooper and also Mystique to kind of learn what exactly went down between them. Because remember, when it came to Val Cooper in an earlier story arc, she was being controlled by the Shadow King and she was told to kill off Mystique. But now we know she did not do that. And the reason why, because, well, Val knew that with her body being controlled by the Shadow King, that she would always continue to finish the job, to kill off Mystique. And so instead, she found a way to knock herself out. Now, originally, she was trying to kill herself, but she kind of knocked herself out. Now, when she woke up, she was confronted by Nick Fury, who said, hey, listen, I got a game plan. So we are going to remove you for a short period of time and allow Mystique to pretend to be you as a way to get close to the Shadow King and wait for the right moment to attack. Now for Rogue, she was very upset about this because when she came back after going through the Siege Perilous as well, she heard Mystique was dead. And let's not forget, Mystique is her adoptive mother. And so finding out that you were gone for a short period of time to only find out your mom is now gone, she was heartbroken. She's kind of like, how dare you make me go through those kind of feels? Mystique said, but you don't understand. I did this as a way to help protect you. Now, once you have the two characters sit down to talk to one another, they're able to, become friends again, or not friends, but mother and daughter. Either way, Mystique and Rogue are now back on good terms once again. Now, like I said earlier, when it comes to X-Factor, the original X-Factor team, they're going to rejoin the X-Men, but that leaves room open for someone else or a new team of characters to take up the mantle. And so when it comes to Val Cooper, she says, hey, listen, I want to go ahead and recruit you, Polaris, and also Strong Guy to be able to put together a new team of X-Factor that is going to work for the government. Now, this is also a way to get Peter David, one of the best writers for Marvel Comics, to come over and write for X-Factor as well. Now, by the end of the book, you really didn't have Charles Xavier realize that he is unable to save his son. And right now, his son is going to stay in a coma. And so because of that, he is brought back outside by the original X-Men, who are kind of like, hey, listen, we're here with you now, and you're here with us. Let's work together again as the X-Men. But the problem is right now, he has 14 different team members for his X-Men, the highest number he had in a very long time. He's kind of like, what in the world am I going to do with 14 different members of the X-Men? And so this leads into him having two different teams in the 1990s, known as Gold Team and Blue Team. And those teams came very important in the early 90s comics for X-Men. But with that being said, this is where we are going to end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next time. Later.